Hello, everyone. Welcome to this final lecture of equity, health and equity. Uh, that is HREQ 1930. Today's talk will be about equity for the extremely marginalized. And in this seminar, we will take the refugees as the prime example of this extremity of marginalization. Now, of course, marginalized communities exist within any state and country. This marginalization is affected through exclusions from services, from provisions, but also implicit institutional racism and so on that you have gone through throughout this course. But let me turn to why I consider refugees as extremely marginalized. You see, marginalized groups, say within Canada, uh, they can still be legal citizens of Canada, although still marginalized and excluded. However, in the case of refugees, that does not apply because they are not citizens of the state where they arrive, the country that they arrive. I am currently in Lesbos, Greece. So greetings from the beautiful island. In this island, there were at times more than 20,000 refugees trapped, and I will get to that in shortly as to why and how they were trapped here. So to get back to the marginalization of refugees, first, they are not citizens of, say, Greece, where I am located right now, or in Canada when they arrive. So they do not qualify for the rights that a citizen would normally qualify. Uh, and secondly, they are not legal migrants. That means they have not entered the country with a visa, with a work visa, work permit in order to be able to access services, employment, and so on. They have what is known in refugee studies, they have crossed borders irregularly. You might have also in the case of United States terminologies such as illegal entry and so on do exist. So first, they are not citizens of the country. Secondly, they are not even legally arriving in the country. So because of their situations, many of them have lost or were not unable to obtain a passport or visa to another country. So, for the sake of saving their lives and the lives of their families and children, these refugees are forced to cross borders without the right documentation or the necessary documentation. And that puts them again in a more marginalized position than average marginalized population in, let's say, Greece, such as the Roma population, which are highly marginalized, or other migrant communities that are marginalized, such as Albanians and so on, and discriminated against, of course. Uh, these refugees have additional dimensions of marginalization, not no legal status, no citizenship, and what they receive upon arrival is a tentative protection until they have had their asylum interviews and decision upon it. So if they are recognized as refugees, then they receive a residence permit and they can live here and start learning the language and trying to obtain employment. But until then, they have only a tentative protection. And in case of the rejection of their cases, they will be deported. Now, usually, we will get to this in a second. Countries cannot just randomly deport people. This is part of the Geneva Convention, 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees. But let me give you first a little bit of a background to that. The 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees was decided in the aftermath of World War II. You see, during World War II, as you may be aware, Europe was on fire. War was waging in every corner of Europe. And as a result, millions and millions of people were displaced from what is known today as Russia, Poland, Hungary, Greece, Italy, Spain, Germany, France, you name it. There was a massive displacement of people around Europe due to the war that was waging for years. Sorry. So when the war was over and Nazi Germany was defeated, the attention of the powers that were victorious, which means United States, uh, the United Kingdom, France, Canada, the former Soviet Union, and so on. Their attention was drawn to the millions and millions of displaced people. As a result, they drafted the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees, within Europe, of course, but we'll get to that point. So, in the process of this drafting of the convention, the various powers had, of course, their own interests. You have to understand at that point, France and the United Kingdom had many colonies from which they were extracting wealth and natural resources. And of course, they were keen to keeping them. And the poverty that colonialism produced was something that they did not want to draw their attention. Nor the Americans' foreign policy interests had any intention of blocking their economic interests. The Soviet Union at that time, during the drafting before the 1951, 1949, 50, they withdrew from the process of drafting. Their argument was that one, uh, the convention is designed or being designed at that point in a way that interests the political agendas of Western powers. And two, that if we are talking about victims, if we are talking about refugees that are victims of injustice, then economic injustice should also qualify for a refugee status. But the European powers rejected that, including the United States. They did not include economics and economic difficulties in the convention. So by the time that the convention, 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugee emerged, among the categories that qualify one as a refugee, economics was not included. Was completely excluded. There's no mention of economic suffering and deprivation. So, as you can see, the convention itself had a highly political dimension. It emerged out of a pan-European war that was, of course, economically driven as much as politically driven. It emerged in the aftermath of catastrophes and horrendous actions by the Nazi regime in Germany, Nazi Germany, the concentration camps, and so on. So the convention emerged out of the politics of a time and continued to play a big role in the aftermath of World War II in a political way, because the Western powers used it very often to discredit their enemies, if you want to call it that way. So whether the Soviet blocs or other individual countries uh, were targeted as not allowing political dissent and freedom of political choice and opinion. Not that that was very uh, strictly followed by the Western countries, because during the Cold War, Western countries persecuted and harassed and in many ways made the lives of people who were, let's say, socialist extremely difficult. So, but nevertheless, the convention was used against the enemies of Western powers. Now, this background, nevertheless, is intended to give you a brief understanding that the convention was designed to protect those whose states were not protecting them. So, persecution based on religion, based on religious belief, based on political opinions and orientations, based on ethnic affiliation and social affiliation. These categories would grant one asylum or the status protection by the host country upon after arrival. So upon arrival, one applies for asylum. Then there will be an interview in which one has to prove that one falls under one of these categories. And upon proving that, then one is, or upon convincing the authorities of being persecuted based on political, religious, ethnic, or social affiliations, then one is granted asylum and permanent protection in the country, in the host country. Now, let us move from here to uh, talking about a little bit more about the politicization of this idea of refugees and the convention. Like I mentioned to you, during Cold War, uh, Western allies, which pretty much includes all of Western Europe after World War II, um, have used this against back then in the until the 90s, early 90s, against the Soviet bloc, the Eastern bloc, for so the people fleeing socialist governments in Eastern Europe. Um, and this is not to say that there was no repression in Eastern Europe, but it was also a political tool for Western Europe and North America to uh, promote its own free societies versus the non-free societies of socialists and communists, and how, of course, that is bad for humanity. But it was not just against them. Any country whose governments was not aligned with Western interests would be targeted with this same convention. So human rights became a tool for Western political agendas. So, for example, we will get to this, but to give you a brief hint, during the 1980s, when Afghanistan had a socialist regime, uh, Western governments were accepting Afghan refugees without much trouble. Pretty much every Afghan who arrived in the West was accepted as a refugee. Whereas now, when the regime in Afghanistan is controlled, funded by the Western world, despite the fact that there is a continuous, on a daily basis, suicide attacks and continuous civil war, protection and asylum is not easily granted. Oftentimes, European countries such as Sweden, Germany, directly deport Afghans to the war zone. Some of these Afghans that are being returned, I have met many of them who have arrived here, who were minors, say in Sweden, upon age of maturity, they were deported to a country that they had not seen because they were born outside Afghanistan. Their families had fled the war zone, war-torn country back in the 80s, and they were born, let's say, in Iran, They fled Iran because there was no hope in Afghanistan. They had never been to Afghanistan, so Afghanistan, even though they were considered Afghans, they were complete. The country was completely foreign to them because they had never been there. They had no social familial relations. Nevertheless, they've been deported. So the point is that the entire question of asylum has been a political tool in the West. And in the recent years, in the last 10 years, one could say at least, uh, refugees and migrants who flee their countries due to various reasons. They have been also politicized by right wing politicians, right wing political parties. They have been used as political tools and pawns in order to further their own agenda within their own societies to gain more votes by promoting anti immigrant, anti migrant, anti refugee policies. So the entire context of refugees is highly politicized. Now, in on the Greek island, this is not much different. On the Greek island of Lesbos, where I live, and I've been conducting my research since 2016, the situation has been political, whether from the side of European Union, the Greek state, the local government, and of course other um, personalities who want to gain influence on the local population have utilized the presence of refugees as a political tool. But let me next move on to, after having given you a kind of background on the Refugee Convention and how it has been, the convention as well as the presence of refugees has been a highly politicized issue, although the pretension is to the contrary. Nevertheless, it has been thoroughly politicized. Now, in 2015, a massive inflow of refugees across the Aegean Sea from Turkey into Greek islands such as Lesbos, where I am living, south of here, Chios, Samos, and Kos, were recipients of more than 1 million refugees. The refugees were mostly, predominantly, from three countries that have had ongoing wars for years, if not decades, due to Western policies. These countries include Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. So, as you can see, it is the refugees are the product of Western policies in these countries. And now these refugees were entering European Union en masse because, of course, where else to go? Turkey is hosting some more than 3 million Syrian refugees, Lebanon 2 million. There is no uh, these countries to begin with do not have the capacity to handle this many people. So about a bit more than 1 million of them crossed the sea, and it's a treacherous and perilous journey. Many people have drowned. You may have heard of very famous case in 2015, Aylan Kurdi, infant that was washed away to the Turkish coast after their boat, the rubber dinghy, sank and the child drowned. So, like I mentioned, more than 1 million people made the journey across this perilous strip. It's not very far. You can see it with your naked eyes, the other side, but it is straight and the currents can get very strong. The winds and the waves can easily over flip and overturn and rubber dinghy which is designed usually for 10, 12 people, but the smugglers put more than 50 people, 40, 50, up to 60 people on one of these rubber dinghies. Uh, Many of them, because of the heavy weight of the number of refugees for which the rubber dinghies are not designed, uh, uh, run out of fuel midway, and then they are stranded if the currents wash them out of this strait into the open sea. Then we don't even know about those numbers of deaths, because in the open sea they will not wash away that easily on the shores. So having said that, in 2015-16, uh, this large number of refugees were arriving on a daily basis, up to 10,000 people arriving on the shores of this little island. And so in 2016, uh, the European institutions, led by German Chancellor Angela Merkel, struck a deal with Turkey. Now, before this deal came into effect, which is known as EU-Turkey Statement, or EU-Turkey deal, that came into effect on March 20th, 2016, the islands such as Lesbos, Chios, Samos, and Kos were transit islands, meaning the refugees would arrive, they would be 1 or 2 days here to have a brief registration, get an initial document that stated their name and date of birth and so on, and nationality. And then they would get on a ferry, buy a ticket, get on a ferry, and move to the mainland and make their way up to northern countries such as Germany, France, or Sweden, and the UK, of course. Now, excuse me. Now, with the EU Turkey statement or deal coming into effect on March 20th, 2016, the entire situation for the islands changed, because as part of the EU Turkey deal, uh, Turkey would actively prevent the refugees from crossing the sea. Meanwhile, the other side of the deal was that as part of this comprehensive deal, the Aegean Islands became zones of exception, uh, which basically means cancellation of the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees. Now, the 1951 Convention was meant only for European refugees. It was in 1967 that a protocol was ratified by the UN General Assembly. It's called the 1967 Protocol, that extended those rights of 1951 Convention to all geographical locations. So while the 1951 Convention applied only to European refugees due to World War II, the 1967 Protocol extended it to every human being. As a result, today anyone arriving in Canada can claim uh, asylum. They can go through the whole process, and if their asylum is accepted, then they're granted asylum and they can stay. Now, some countries did not ratify the 1967 extension. For instance, Turkey. The Republic of Turkey never ratified the 1967 extension protocol, which is extending the same rights to all people. What does that mean? That means that unless one is European and one is displaced before 1951, one has no right or no access to asylum. One cannot become a refugee in Turkey. So that means the Syrians, the Afghans, the Iraqis who flee permanent war, they cannot claim they cannot claim asylum. They will not be considered refugees in Turkey, because Turkey never signed onto the 1967 protocol that extended the rights. So that is another reason why these refugees cannot actually find legal status in Turkey, because there is no avenue for them to do that. As a result, they try to enter European Union, where they the countries have collectively ratified the 1967 protocol and the European laws acknowledged the 1951 and its 1967 extension. So the 2016 agreement between the European Union and Turkey made these islands de facto outside these laws. Uh, One of the rules that were taken away, one of the rights of refugees according to the 1951 convention, is freedom of the movement uh, within the territory of that host state. So let's say a refugee arrives in Canada while they're claiming asylum and their asylum case is in process. They have the right to move within Canada. They might have to ask for some permission, but they should be granted, and unless there is some fear of criminality, no one can deny them freedom of movement within Canada. However, for the refugees arriving on the Greek islands in the east, the Aegean Sea, these rights were taken away with the EU-Turkey deal. So this is known as geographical restrictions imposed on the refugees. Another aspect was that deportations were, according to 1951 and the whole Convention on the Refugees, including the 1967 extension, one cannot randomly deport a refugee to any country one wishes. One can only deport them to their country of origin if there is no fear of persecution and danger to their lives. However, the EU-Turkey deal allows the Greek state to deport refugees from other countries, such as Syrian refugees, Afghan refugees, and so on, Iranian refugees, and so on, directly to Turkey instead of to their country of origin. Even though in their country of origin they can prove that there is a danger to their lives, and therefore the country cannot deport them there, they claim that Turkey is a safe country. But that defies the right of refugees, because in Turkey these refugees cannot claim asylum. So it's completely in violation. The EU-Turkey deal violates the very 1951 convention. And never mind that there's been pushbacks in the sea and on the land and so on. But I want to get a little bit further. I want to get into what is the situation of refugees on the island, those who arrive. And this is the part where we will get into the camps. So the refugees who arrive here, they are taken to a reception and registration center, reception and identification center, known RIC. And of course, their fingerprints are taken, their names of parents, date of birth, nationality, and a brief interview about where they came from and so on, but not with much detail. And upon arrival, of course, they end up in a camp that has been notoriously known. In September 2020, the camp burned down in its entirety, but we will get to that in a bit. For now, I just want to point out, you can Google it. There's been many articles, including Guardian and many other English newspapers who have had articles on this notoriously known camp, also known as the Guardian had once described it as Guantanamo of Europe. It has been also known as the worst camp on European soil, and so on. The name of the camp is Moria. The reason for the name is because it's located next to a village named Moria Village on the island. So before we go um, into the details of the camp and how the marginalization of these refugees now takes place on the island, let's take a brief break, and we will continue right after this short break.